One of the most important waterways on Earth is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And yet through that narrow gap passes roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on the planet, along with a massive share of the world's liquefied natural gas. It's called the Strait of Hormuz, and for decades it has quietly been one of the most dangerous choke points in global trade. This week, that danger stopped being quiet. Iran signaled it was prepared to close the strait entirely. And within hours, the United States military began moving assets into position. This is the story of what that response actually looks like, why it matters far beyond the Middle East, and what it could mean for every driver, every business, and every economy in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and across Europe. Let's start with geography, because geography is the whole reason this story matters. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open waters of the Arabian Sea. Every tanker carrying crude oil out of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar has to pass through this single corridor. There is no alternate route that can absorb that volume. Pipelines exist that bypass parts of the strait, but they can only carry a fraction of what moves by sea. In practical terms, if Hormuz closes, global oil supply doesn't just tighten, it gets rerouted through a bottleneck that doesn't have the capacity to replace it. That's why, historically, any Iranian rhetoric about closing the strait sends an immediate ripple through energy markets, even before a single ship is stopped. Oil traders don't wait for confirmation. They price in risk the moment the threat is credible, and Iran has made this threat before. During periods of heightened tension, most notably in 2019, the US and its allies accused Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps of harassing and even seizing commercial tankers in and around the strait, using fast attack boats, limpet mines, and electronic interference to disrupt shipping without triggering a full naval confrontation. That playbook is well known to U.S. Central Command, and it shapes how the Navy prepares for scenarios like the one now being reported. So what does the American response actually look like when a threat like this escalates? It starts with presence. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, is built specifically around this region, and its job in a crisis is to project enough force that closing the strait becomes too costly for Iran to attempt. That typically means moving a carrier strike group into the region or repositioning one that's already nearby. A group built around a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, escorted by guided missile destroyers and cruisers, all networked together with radar and missile defense systems capable of tracking hundreds of targets at once. Alongside that firepower, the Navy relies heavily on mine countermeasure ships and helicopters because historically, mines, not missiles, have been the weapon Iran is most likely to use to threaten the strait without directly engaging U.S. forces. According to defense officials cited in past deployments, this kind of posture isn't just about being ready to fight. It's about deterrence, making the cost of closing the strait so obviously high that the threat never has to be tested. That's a difficult balance. Move too few assets and you risk looking unprepared. Move too many and you risk the appearance of provocation, which can escalate tensions rather than calm them. U.S. commanders have walked this line for decades in the Gulf, and reports suggest the current response follows that same doctrine. Visible strength paired with public statements emphasizing that freedom of navigation, not confrontation, is the goal. The United States doesn't do this alone either. The UK's Royal Navy has maintained a standing presence in the Gulf for years, in part because so much of Britain's energy security is tied to the same shipping lanes. France has periodically rotated naval assets through the region as well, And Gulf partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, have their own navies and coast guards that coordinate, at least informally, with Western forces when tensions spike. What you're often looking at in a moment like this isn't a single country reacting, but a loose coalition of maritime powers all converging on the same interest, keeping the strait open, because nearly all of them depend on it in one way or another. Now, here's where this stops being a distant geopolitical story and starts being something that shows up in your life directly. Oil priced in dollars trades on a global market, which means a disruption in the Gulf doesn't stay in the Gulf. When traders believe there's a real risk of Hormuz closing, even for a short period, crude oil futures move immediately. That shift works its way through the supply chain in days, not months, and it shows up first at the gas pump. For American drivers, that could mean a jump of anywhere from a few cents to well over $1 per gallon, depending on how serious and how prolonged the disruption is believed to be. For the UK and Europe, where fuel is already taxed more heavily and where several countries remain more exposed to global energy price swings following the shifts of the past few years, the impact can be sharper still. Canada, as a net energy exporter, sits in a slightly different position. Higher oil prices can actually benefit parts of its economy, but its consumers still feel the pain at the pump, just like everyone else. And a serious global disruption affects Canadian markets and currency too. Beyond fuel prices, there's a second, quieter effect: shipping and insurance costs. When a region becomes higher risk, maritime insurers raise premiums for vessels transiting through it, and some shipping companies choose to reroute entirely, adding time and cost to global trade. That cost doesn't just stay with the shipping company. It eventually gets passed down the chain to everyday goods, from electronics to clothing to food, in the form of higher prices months down the line. This is one of the reasons economists watch choke points like Hormuz so closely. It's not just an oil story, it's an inflation story, a shipping story, and ultimately a cost of living story for people who may never think twice about a strait on the other side of the world. So what happens next? If history is any guide, there are a few likely paths. The first and most common is that the crisis peaks in rhetoric and military posturing, but doesn't escalate into direct closure or major conflict. Both sides recognize that actually shutting the strait would be economically devastating for Iran as well, since Iran itself depends on that same waterway to export its own oil. The second path is a period of limited, deniable disruption. A seized tanker here, a mine incident there, enough to spike fear and prices without triggering a full military response. The third, and least likely but most consequential path, is a direct confrontation between Iranian and coalition forces in or near the strait, which would represent a major escalation with global economic consequences far beyond energy prices alone. For now, what's confirmed is posture, not conflict, ships repositioning, statements being issued, and markets reacting to risk rather than to any actual closure. That distinction matters, and it's worth remembering every time a headline uses dramatic language before the facts are fully in. The right approach, especially with a story this consequential, is to watch the reporting from defense officials and verified outlets over the coming days, rather than reacting to the first wave of claims. If you want to understand how we got here, the years of tension between the US and Iran that set the stage for this moment, there's a video linked on screen now that breaks down that entire history in detail. And if you want to stay ahead of how this story develops, this channel will keep tracking it as new information comes in. Subscribe if you want that coverage delivered as it happens, and drop a comment below with what you think happens next in the strait. Thanks for watching.